In 1492, a Jewish man stood before the most powerful monarchs in Europe and placed 30,000 gold ducats on the table. He was not begging, he was negotiating. His name was Isaac Abravanel, and he was the royal treasurer of Spain, the man who had financed the war against the Moors, the man whose banking network stretched from Lisbon to Naples. He was offering Ferdinand and Isabella a fortune to cancel the decree that would expel every unconverted Jew from their kingdoms. The king and queen refused, and on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, the same date on which, according to Jewish tradition, both temples in Jerusalem had been destroyed, Isaac Abravanel walked out of Spain with his 3 sons, leaving behind everything he had built for the second time in his life. But here is the part that most people never learn. The expulsion of 1492 was not the beginning of this family's story. It was not even the middle. Between the late 1300s and the middle of the 1500s, the Abravanel family, one of the most documented Sephardic lineages in existence, was expelled, converted by force, persecuted, displaced, and driven from their homes at least 5 separate times across 4 centuries in 4 different countries. And every single time, they rebuilt. Every single time, they climbed back to positions of power, influence, and wealth. And every single time, the same pattern repeated. They became indispensable to the state, and then the state destroyed them anyway. This is not a metaphor. This is an accounting ledger written in blood and notarized by royal courts. To understand how one family could be expelled 5 times and survive, you first need to understand the peculiar position that elite Jewish families occupied in medieval and early modern Europe. Kings needed money. Wars needed financing. Tax systems needed administrators who could read, calculate, and manage complex networks of credit across borders. Jewish financiers filled that role precisely because they were outsiders. They had no competing loyalty to local nobility, no ancestral land claims, no rival ambitions for the throne. They served the crown directly, and this made them simultaneously invaluable and expendable. Invaluable when the treasury was empty, expendable when the mob needed a target, when the church demanded purity, or when a new monarch wanted to seize accumulated Jewish wealth without the inconvenience of repayment. The Abravanels understood this dynamic with surgical clarity, and for generations they played the game, knowing, at some level, that the game was rigged. The family first enters the historical record around 1284 in Seville, one of the great cities of medieval Castile. Don Judah Abravanel served as treasurer and tax collector under King Sancho IV, and later under Ferdinand IV. According to the Encyclopedia JUDAICA, in 1310, Judah and other Jews guaranteed the loans that financed the siege of Algeciras, essentially bankrolling Castile's military expansion. The family claimed descent from King David himself, a tradition recorded by Isaac Abravanel in his own writings and taken seriously enough that Manasseh ben Israel, the great Amsterdam rabbi of the 17th century, believed it when he married into the family 150 years later. Whether or not the Davidic lineage was historical fact, it tells us something important. The Abravanels did not see themselves as marginal. They saw themselves as a royal house in exile. The first catastrophe came in 1391. On June 6th of that year, Catholic mobs in Seville, incited by the Archdeacon Ferrand Martinez, who had been calling for anti-Jewish violence for more than a decade despite direct orders from the king to stop, attacked the Jewish quarter. According to contemporary chronicles, approximately 4,000 Jews were murdered in Seville alone. Those who survived faced a stark choice: baptism or death. Within 3 months, the violence had spread to more than 70 cities across Castile and Aragon. The historian Joseph Perez wrote that Spanish Judaism never recovered from this catastrophe. Samuel Abravanel of Seville, a man described by the scholar Menahem ben Zerah as intelligent, a lover of wise men, and eager to study whenever the stress of time permitted, was among those forced to accept baptism. According to the chronicler Abraham Zacuto, writing in his Sefer Yuhasin around 1504, Samuel took the Christian name Juan Sanchez de Sevilla. He was subsequently appointed comptroller in Castile, a position that demonstrates the grotesque logic of forced conversion. One day you are a Jew marked for death. The next day you are a Christian appointed to manage state finances. The same skills, the same person, the same brain. Only the name changed, and the freedom to pray as your ancestors prayed. But Samuel did not remain Juan Sanchez. At some point, the exact date is unclear in the records, he and his family fled to Portugal, where they reverted to Judaism. This was the first expulsion. Not a royal decree with a formal date, but something raw. A pogrom that made life in Seville impossible, followed by forced conversion, followed by flight. The Abravanel family crossed the border with their knowledge, their connections, and their determination intact. In Portugal, they began again. Samuel's grandson, Judah, rose to prominence in the Portuguese court. According to surviving documents, he was in the financial service of the Infante Ferdinand of Portugal, who in his will of 1437 ordered the repayment to Judah of the vast sum of 506,000 reis blancs. Later, Judah served the Duke of Braganza, and his export business brought him into trade relations with Flanders. This was the Abravanel method. Arrive in a new country, identify the power structure, make yourself essential to it, and use the resulting wealth and access to protect your community. It worked for a while. Judah's son, Isaac, was born in Lisbon in 1437. He would become the most famous Abravanel of all, and his life reads like a compendium of every force that shaped Jewish existence in the 15th century. Isaac was a Talmudist, a philosopher, a biblical commentator whose works are still studied today, and a financial genius who served as treasurer and royal advisor to King Afonso V of Portugal. According to testimony documented in Brazilian journalist Alberto Dines's study O Baú de Abravanel, Isaac was considered the shield and wall of his community. He used his position at court to ransom Jewish captives from Morocco in the 1470s, organizing collections across Portugal to fund the rescue. Then, in 1481, Afonso V died. His successor, João II, was a different kind of monarch, suspicious, centralizing, and willing to destroy the feudal nobility that had previously checked royal power. When the Duke of Braganza was accused of conspiracy and executed, Isaac Abravanel was implicated. Whether the accusation was genuine or a pretext to seize Jewish wealth remains debated by historians. What is not debated is the result. In 1483, Isaac fled Portugal with his wife and 2 young children, leaving behind, as he later wrote in his commentary on the Book of Joshua, everything he had accumulated. João II confiscated his entire fortune. This was the second expulsion. Isaac arrived in Toledo, the city where his ancestors had once lived, almost penniless. He was 46 years old. He had just lost everything for the first time. He rebuilt within months. Isaac obtained a position with a Jewish banking firm in Castile and began writing his biblical commentaries with renewed intensity, completing his works on Joshua, Judges, and Samuel in 6 months. His reputation as a financial mind preceded him, and soon Ferdinand and Isabella summoned him to take over the state treasury. The irony is almost too precise to be believed. In the very same year that the notorious Tomás de Torquemada became Grand Inquisitor of Spain, 1483, Abravanel became treasurer to the Catholic monarchs. The Inquisition hunted converted Jews suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. The treasury depended on a practicing Jew to function. These 2 facts coexisted in the same court, in the same year, under the same rulers. For nearly a decade, Isaac Abravanel financed the Reconquista. Together with his colleague Abraham Sr., he supplied provisions for the royal army and advanced considerable sums for the war against the Moors. When Granada fell on January 2, 1492, completing the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, Isaac Abravanel had helped make it possible. 3 months later, Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree, ordering every unconverted Jew to leave Spain by the end of July. This was the third expulsion. And this time, Isaac did not go quietly. According to multiple sources, including the Israeli historian Benzion Netanyahu's landmark biography, Don Isaac Abravanel, statesman and philosopher. Isaac attempted to negotiate the revocation of the decree. He offered Ferdinand 30,000 ducats, a staggering sum, roughly equivalent to the cost of a military campaign. A well-known legend, recorded by several contemporaries, holds that when Torquemada learned of this offer, he burst into the royal chamber, threw a crucifix at the king's feet, and said, "Judas sold our Lord for 30 pieces of silver. His Majesty is about to sell him again for 30,000. Whether this exact scene occurred is debatable. What is documented is that Isabella reportedly told Isaac, "Do you think this comes from me? The Lord has put that thought into the heart of the king." The offer was refused. On the 9th of Av, 5252 in the Hebrew calendar, July 30th, 1492, Isaac Abravanel walked out of Spain with his 3 sons: Judah, who would become a renowned physician and philosopher, author of the Dialogues of Love; Joseph, who would become a physician and scholar; and Samuel, who would become a financier, whose wealth would be estimated at more than 200,000 gold zecchini. The same day that Columbus set sail for the New World, with ships partly financed by confiscated Jewish assets, the Abravanels joined tens of thousands of refugees heading east. They reached Naples. In Naples, Isaac entered the service of King Ferdinand II. He was 65 years old, starting over for the 3rd time, in his 3rd country. When the Spanish king, Ferdinand, learned that the expelled Jews had found refuge in Naples, he demanded that the Neapolitan king deny them shelter. The young king of Naples ignored the demand. Isaac spent his final years in intense literary activity, producing the bulk of his celebrated biblical commentaries, including his messianic works, Wellsprings of Salvation and Herald of Salvation, in which he interpreted the expulsions as part of a divine plan that would ultimately lead to redemption. He died in Venice in 1508 at the age of 71 and was buried in Padua. A life defined by 5 decades of service to 3 different crowns in 3 different countries, each of which eventually betrayed him. But the family story did not end with Isaac's death. It continued through his youngest son, Samuel, who was born in Lisbon in 1473 and sent by his father to Salonica to study Talmud under Joseph Fassi. Samuel eventually settled in Naples, where he became financier to the Spanish viceroy, Don Pedro de Toledo. The contemporary poet, Samuel Usque, writing in his Consolation for the Tribulations of Israel, published in Ferrara in 1553, described Samuel Abravanel as 3 times great: great in scholarship, great in name, and great in wealth. His fortune exceeded 200,000 gold zecchini, making him one of the wealthiest Jews in Europe. Samuel's wife, Benvenida Abravanel, who was also his first cousin, the daughter of Isaac's brother Jacob, became one of the most remarkable women in Sephardic history. In Naples, she served as tutor and mentor to Eleonora de Toledo, the daughter of the viceroy himself. Eleonora, who would later marry Cosimo I de' Medici and become Grand Duchess of Tuscany, honored Benvenida throughout her life and called her mother. This was the Abravanel paradox in miniature. A Jewish woman so respected that she raised the daughter of the most powerful Christian official in southern Italy, in a society that officially considered Jews subhuman. Then, the pattern repeated. In 1510, King Ferdinand II of Aragon, the same Ferdinand who had expelled the Jews from Spain 18 years earlier, issued an edict of expulsion for the Jews of Naples. According to the Jewish Women's Archive, the Abravanels were among 200 families exempted from the decree, but only in exchange for the payment of a large sum. They bought their right to stay, for the moment. This was the fourth expulsion, or rather, the fourth time the machinery of expulsion was activated against them. They survived it through the only tool that had ever worked: money. 23 years later, the machine came back. In 1533, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who now ruled Naples as part of his vast empire, ordered the expulsion of all Jews from the kingdom. And here, Benvenida Abravanel did something extraordinary. She organized a petition to the emperor, enlisting the support of several Neapolitan princesses, possibly including her former pupil, Eleonora de Toledo, who was then 11 years old, but whose father, the viceroy, argued against the expulsion for economic reasons. The petition succeeded. The decree was postponed for 10 years. Think about what this means. A Jewish woman, in a society where Jews had no legal standing, no military power, no political representation, used personal relationships cultivated over decades to delay an imperial decree by a full decade. Not through violence, not through revolution, through the quiet, painstaking work of making yourself necessary and making yourself loved by the people whose power could protect you. But 10 years is 10 years, not forever. In 1540, Charles V issued a new edict. Jews in Naples must wear the identifying badge within 6 months or face severe consequences. Many Jewish families began to leave. The Abravanels, according to the sources, could have remained. Their exempted status from 1510 still technically held. They chose to leave anyway. Samuel Abravanel, now 67 years old, feared for his family's safety. When they departed Naples in January of 1541, according to the Jewish Women's Archive, Samuel turned to the city scribe and judge and 9 witnesses to make his last will and testament, a common practice that allowed men to leave property to their wives and daughters, rather than relying on traditional male lines of inheritance. He feared bandits and murderers on the roads, which had become dangerous due to the influx of wealthy Jewish refugees. This was the 5th expulsion. The Abravanels accepted the invitation of Ercole II, Duke of Ferrara, and headed north. They spent about a year and a half in Venice, before settling in Ferrara, which had become a major refuge for Sephardic Jews. In Ferrara, Benvenida became the dominant force in the Jewish community. She expanded the family's banking business, obtaining permission from the authorities in Florence to open 5 banking establishments in Tuscany by 1547. When Dona Gracia Nasi, another legendary Sephardic figure, arrived in Ferrara in 1548, the 2 most powerful Jewish women in the Mediterranean world found themselves in the same small Italian city, their families' interests not always aligned. Samuel died in Ferrara in 1547, reportedly from a drug that left him paralyzed. His will, which Benvenida kept private for 3 years to protect the family's reputation, named her as his primary heir. A decision that sparked a major rabbinic debate stretching from Italy to the Ottoman Empire when his illegitimate son contested the arrangement. Benvenida's defense, recorded in one of the few direct statements attributed to her, argued that while Jewish law did not allow a wife to inherit from her husband, she could acquire his possessions as a gift, especially when the bequest was made by a man who mentioned the possibility of his death. It was a legal argument, as precise as any her father-in-law Isaac had ever crafted, and it was made by a woman who had survived 3 expulsions, raised a future duchess, delayed an imperial decree, and built a banking empire across Italy. The Abravanel story does not end in Ferrara. It scatters, as Sephardic stories do, across the map. Members of the family who had been forcibly baptized in Portugal during the mass conversion of 1497 preserved the name Abravanel in secret for more than a century. In the 17th century, they revived it openly in the Sephardic communities of Amsterdam and London, where they emerged from the shadows of crypto-Judaism into the relative freedom of the Dutch Republic. Jona Abravanel, who died in Amsterdam in 1667, was a poet who wrote elegies in Portuguese and published liturgical works alongside Dr. Ephraim Bueno. He was the nephew of Manasseh ben Israel, the great Amsterdam rabbi whose wife, Rachel, was herself an Abravanel. And it was Manasseh, married into this family that had been expelled from everywhere, who travelled to London in 1655 to petition Oliver Cromwell for the readmission of Jews to England, from which they had been banned since 1290. He succeeded. The country that had expelled its Jews 365 years earlier opened its doors again, in part because of the advocacy of a man whose wife carried the blood of 5 expulsions in her veins. There is a Ladino saying that was recorded in Salonica, the great Ottoman city where tens of thousands of Spanish Jews rebuilt their lives after 1492. The saying goes, "Ya basta mi nombre que es Abravanel." My name is enough, and my name is Abravanel. It is a statement of identity so compressed that it functions almost as a poem. It says, "I do not need to explain where I come from, because my name contains the entire history." It says, "I carry the weight of Seville and Lisbon and Toledo and Naples and Ferrara and Amsterdam in 6 syllables." It says, "You cannot destroy what I am, because what I am has survived everything you have done." In 2015, the Spanish Parliament passed a law offering citizenship to the descendants of Jews expelled in 1492. The law described the expulsion as one of the shameful events in the country's past. Applicants had until October 1, 2019, to prove their Sephardic descent and become Spanish nationals, 527 years after their ancestors were told to convert or leave. For the descendants of the Abravanels, the offer carried a weight that no legislation could fully capture. Spain was asking them to come home to a country that their family had served as treasurers, financiers, and advisors for 2 centuries before deciding their presence was intolerable. It was the final turn of a cycle that began in 1284, when Don Judah Abravanel first guaranteed loans for the crown of Castile. The Abravanel story is often told as a tragedy, and it is one. But to stop at tragedy is to miss what makes it historically significant. This family did not merely survive. They negotiated. They calculated. They offered 30,000 ducats to a king and petitioned an emperor through his own viceroy's daughter. They sent their children to study in Salonica and their capital, to banking networks that crossed the Mediterranean. They understood, with a clarity that most people never achieve about their own circumstances, that the system they served would eventually turn against them, and they prepared for it every time without ever abandoning the belief that their service had value and their survival had purpose. Isaac Abravanel wrote in his commentary on the Book of Kings that exile was not the absence of God, but the presence of a test. That the suffering of Israel was not evidence of abandonment, but evidence of a covenant so demanding that it required a people willing to be expelled from the entire known world and still refuse to stop being who they were. 5 expulsions. 4 centuries. Seville to Lisbon to Toledo to Naples to Ferrara, and from there to Amsterdam, London, Salonica, and eventually to every continent on earth. 30,000 ducats placed on a table before a king who said no, and a family that responded to that no by walking out of Spain on the 9th of Av, the date of ultimate destruction, carrying nothing but their names and the unshakable conviction that their names would be enough. Ya basta mi nombre que es Abrabanel. 534 years later, It still is.